morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this very important segment today on the 7th day of June 2023. Well, the big news today is the interest rate hike. Once again, we'll take a look at that in detail, and we will be finishing off today we'll go through with all the news today, and then we'll finish off with the upcoming functions and events. So, ladies and gentlemen, right now, let's take a look at this interest rate hike and the other news. Once again, welcome to the show. Well, in Brisbane today is mostly sunny. At this point in time, it's 15 degrees, but it's going to get a little bit warmer during the day. A pleasant time of the year, I must say. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's get the show on the road with the first news.
Laura, inflation has passed its peak, so why did the RBA lift rates again?
Well, they got nervous, Sarah. There have been a few bad indicators. We've seen a resurgence in the real estate market, for example. The CPI jumped from 6.3 to 6.8%, and we've still got this very tight labour market. Now, there's obviously a brawl about last week's minimum wage case, but even before you get to that, you've got a very tight labour market. Wages are going up there. The public service sector wages are going up. All these pressures have changed the Governor's view and the Reserve Bank Board's view that basically the sort of inflation expectations were set, and what Phil Lowe said today was that they wanted to give people more confidence that we would actually reach that lower inflation target.
Now, the Chamber of Commerce was quick to blame today's increase, on that decision you referred to lift the wages of some of Australia's lowest paid workers. What did Phil Lowe have to say about wages and its role in the decision?
Well, he has said that the wage rises are in line with the inflation target as long as productivity lifts. Now, the problem is it's not lifting. But once again, I think the issue here is that it's not been the minimum wage rates until now that have pushed this issue the way it has been. It's been prices, it's been energy prices. There's a lot of reference to services inflation. Now, when you actually work out what that's language for, what it is about the health sector, out of pocket costs in the health sector, which once again reflects the tight labour market. Those costs are going up. So what the Governor has said is, look, we're worried about unit labour costs, as they're called, and we're worried about where they're going, but he's not actually blamed last week's decision. But obviously it starts to change the pendulum of both the policy push and pulls and of the politics from the argument that it's been prices pushing inflation to one where people will say, well, wages are now doing it, that and federal government, you've been encouraging it.
Now, and in terms of just staying with the politics for a minute, obviously for quite a long time people were tolerant of the external forces working on the economy. They seem to be accepting that argument that this was something that was global in effect and to a large degree outside of the government's control. When do the politics shift and people stop giving the government the benefit of the doubt for those international pressures?
Well, I think it's now really teetering a little bit on the scales, Sarah. I mean, there are a few things. The real pressures on inflation, things like energy prices, things like rent, they are sort of either outside the government's control or the government has said it will do something about it. Now, I think obviously on rents, that's a really tricky one because of the standoff in the Senate about housing policy. But the government says, look, we're doing something about out-of-pocket health costs, we're doing something about energy costs, so they've got a bit of an alibi. But it's more that sort of shift in argument about, where the economy is going. They don't have a strong enough case about what they are doing about productivity, though they've got some measures in place. And this is all fine, except, of course, this decision was made despite the fact that we've got weak retail figures, we've got weak construction figures, and the economy is actually slowing.
Actually, Phil Lowe was talking about productivity in Senate estimates when he was there, recommending that people read the Productivity Commission's reports. What happens to this debate? We keep coming back to the question, but where are the politics of productivity? Is it going to be one of the big topics for the second half of this year?
Well, is it a barbecue stopper, Sarah? I'm not sure that it is.
Someone mark the time code.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that. But
I'm not sure that it's a barbecue stopper, but I think the economy stopping is really a barbecue stopper. So I think that whole question of what the government does about reform is a really crucial one, and about productivity. The question is, does the coalition have enough ammunition to push them on this? And I don't think they have a good enough alibi, if you like, about their own productivity record, and it's become a really complicated question. So it's hard to work out whether it'll be productivity or the fact the economy is starting to look like we're going into recession that'll be the government's biggest problem.
Thank you very much, Laura. Good to talk to you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Sarah.
I think that the RBA's decision was really swayed by the expectation that inflation expectations and wage expectations could get out of control, which was really driven by that Fair Work decision last week around minimum wages, because there is a big influencing effect from that decision, and as well as signs that the monthly CPI for April ticked up a little bit. So you could look at it from that one point of view. We're of the view that the RBA has already done enough, and that all the forward-looking indicators of inflation are pointing down, and that there's too much pressure on households with mortgage debt in Australia, which will cause significant downside growth to the economy. So today's decision, I think, just puts us closer towards a potential downturn or a recession in the next 12 months. I'd say the risk of a recession is really high in Australia now.
So as far as you're concerned, this was not the right call?
Well, we've been of the view now for some months that the Reserve Bank should probably hold the cash rate steady. I understand their concerns around potential wage breakouts, but the official wage data does not show signs of a wage breakout. Wages are running at about 3.7% on an annual basis, and we think that the unemployment rate is going to rise from here. And it will be difficult to get wage rises in an environment of a rising unemployment rate. I think that the Reserve Bank is paying too much attention or placing too much emphasis on backward-looking inflation data and also on some backward-looking growth indicators. But when I look at the forward-looking indicators of inflation, they're all pointing in the right way. And the experience overseas shows us that inflation can fall quite quickly, like it is in the US. It's not falling maybe as fast as the Fed would like, but it will slow in Australia over the next 6 months. And I worry that we don't need to have these many rate rises to get inflation down, because we are risking jobs and the economy.
And so the Treasurer was at pains to point out in his media conference after this decision that the Reserve Bank was independent and its job was to squash inflation while not crunching the economy. From what you're saying there, you believe the Reserve Bank is going to the extent where it is actually crunching the economy?
Well, of course, the data's not telling us that at the moment, and that's the problem with the economic indicators, that they are backward-looking. But if I look at the whole broad range of indicators that we get, retail spending is slowing, building construction is down 20 or 25% compared to a year ago, consumer sentiment is at recessionary-like levels, inflation indicators for the next 6 months are pointing down, capital investments likely to decline in the next year. These are all pointing to a slowing economy. And so once you then take into account the lags involved with monetary policy, well, then I'd have to say that the growth outlook over the next 6 to 12 months looks even worse than it is right now, because interest rates have been taken to an even higher level. So if the risk of a US recession is about 50%, well, then the Australian risk of recession would have to be similar as well.
So the actions of the Reserve Bank, as far as you're concerned, are now pointing Australia in the direction of a recession?
Well, I think so. I mean, I suppose it's not just what the Reserve Bank is doing, but also the fact that we have had a very high inflationary environment. So that creates its own issues and problems, because consumers have to make spending decisions based on that. So consumers naturally will change their expenditure because of high inflation. So cost of living and high interest rates will take us down the path of a potential growth downturn. Now, maybe the economy will hold up better than I'm expecting, because maybe consumers still have a lot of accumulated savings that they've saved up over the last few years, and maybe the pass-through of those interest rates won't be as high as normal if more consumers get quite decent discounts on their interest rates or their mortgage rates, which they have so far. But as far as I'm concerned, when I look at the accumulated savings data for households, I see a lot of that savings being accumulated by older households that are less likely to have been the ones that have taken out those large mortgages. And I worry that the middle-aged and younger households who have the largest burden of mortgage debt are being unfairly, I suppose, targeted by all these interest rate rises. Interest rate policy is a very blunt tool, and unfortunately, the burden is on those 1/3 of Australians that hold that large mortgage debt.
And so based on what you're saying there is no way the Reserve should be considering further rate rises in the next couple of months, which seems to be what it's indicating.
I don't see the need for more rate rises unless the economic data surprises me to the upside. So unless we see that the labour market continues to remain in a really tight shape, we don't see any further rises to the unemployment rate, we get another rebound in retail spending, consumer sentiment improves, we generally see a broadening improvement in the economy. That would then tell me, well, maybe the economy is actually holding up quite well and better than where we expect it to. But I don't think the data will play out like that in the next few months. I think the data will slow quite significantly, which to me would indicate that we don't need any more rate rises. But given the RBA's hawkishness and their concern that inflation expectations will get out of hand, along with wage expectations, then the risk is really with another 1 or 2 rate rises from here.
Diana Messina, a number of people in this discussion this afternoon have said they're comfortable enough with recent wage increases, but productivity has to lift. Just for the layperson out there, how is productivity actually measured, and is there any prospect of that happening relatively quickly?
Well, productivity is a measure of GDP growth per hour worked. So if you think about the output per person per hour in the economy, that's ultimately the best measure of GDP growth. Now, the problem is that the measurement of GDP has had quite a lot of issues in the past 2 years. We've had this huge rebound in service jobs, and service jobs typically have lower productivity growth in general. So that has really skewed the productivity numbers. And I worry that the productivity data looks too low because we have had these one-off pandemic impacts. In the last decade, we have generally seen a slowing in Australian productivity growth, but also a slowing in global advanced economy productivity growth because we have moved to a more services-based economy, and services productivity is lower, like I said before. But I worry that the pandemic is causing these one-off issues in the data. Generally, I think that productivity growth will start to improve over the next few quarters. But if we continue to see those unit labour costs, which are a result of low productivity, continue to be high, then that will, of course, worry the Reserve Bank as well.
Yesterday, Lisa, her friend Tracy Chapman said that Kathleen Folbig's first night out of jail had been spent sleeping in a real bed on Tracy Chapman's farm, and that she'd really enjoyed being able to drink out of a real teacup and use real cutlery. And she had a Kahlua and Coke, and she ate pizza for dinner. And Tracy Chapman said that she was just chilling out at the farm and enjoying doing very simple things like patting the horses and the dogs and catching up with a small group of people who visited. And she said it's one day at a time for her. She just wants to take things really, really slowly. And it was interesting hearing that videoed message that was released, because that's the first time we've heard Kathleen Folbig speak publicly since 2019 at the first first judicial inquiry into her convictions. And at that inquiry, it was a very different Kathleen Folbigg. She had shorter hair, it was a much lighter colour, and in the witness box she was very nervous and very quiet, and sometimes struggled to answer some of the questions asked of her. And it was tough for her then, because she was being cross-examined by the lawyer for the DPP and her ex-husband's lawyer, and she was asked on that occasion about 70 times, "Did you kill your children?" And she just kept saying very quietly, no, I didn't.
And you raise her ex-husband. We heard from Craig Folbigg's lawyer yesterday. What's his approach to this?
Well, he said that Craig Folbigg doesn't want to dwell on the deaths of his children. He wants to celebrate their life and to move on with his life. But he said he stands by the view that his 4 children were killed. And remember, it was Craig Folbigg who gave Kathleen Folbigg's diaries to police after the 4 children had died on separate occasions, and that action led to her being arrested and charged. And he also gave evidence at her trial in 2003. He's chosen not to speak publicly since her release. He just issued that statement through his lawyer, but he has a very different view on this. And the Attorney General, in making the announcement of Kathleen Folbigg's pardon, did acknowledge that. He said it's a sad day for Craig Folbigg, and I do acknowledge that he is suffering still over the deaths of his children.
And Jamel, just briefly, the next step is to try and have the sentence, the charges quashed, rather than just the pardoning. How quickly or slowly might that happen?
Well, Tom Bathurst, the retired judge who presided over the inquiry, has yet to release his full report. He just released an interim one. That should take a few weeks, and then Tom Bathurst can refer the matter to the Court of Criminal Appeal. If he doesn't, Kathleen Folbigg's lawyers can do that, and we would imagine it would happen fairly quickly, within a few months, because the Court of Criminal Appeal has all the information it needs in Tom Bathurst's report.
It was a very rare mutation. It was in a gene that we call CALM2, which is a calcium regulation gene, which is important for the function of the heart. It's quite rare, but it's been demonstrated in people around the world to cause heart conditions which can then lead to sudden death, and mainly through a mechanism of rhythm problems of the heart.
Okay, so Kathleen Folbigg carries the same gene mutation, I understand. She obviously didn't succumb to it as her daughters did. So it can lie dormant in some people, can it?
That's exactly right. And what we know in all genetic heart diseases is that you can carry the gene but never actually develop the phenotype or the condition. And that happens within families as well. So, you and I could have the same genetic change. I might develop heart failure in the next 5 years. You may never develop any heart condition at all. So we see that a lot in families. It's a phenomenon called penetrance, which means, you carry the gene problem, but you don't actually develop the disease.
So, Christopher, does this particular mutation only affect girls? Because Kathleen Folbigg's sons, they were affected by a different gene mutation?
Yeah, so there's no discrimination of these genes in the sense that they affect males and females equally, and they're passed on in a fashion that's called autosomal dominant, which means there's a 1 in 2 chance of passing on the gene to the next generation. So whether that's a male or a female, a boy or a girl, there's an equal chance.
So how recently was this gene mutation which affected Kathleen Folbigg's daughters discovered? How long was it before the realisation that there was something there, to knowing exactly what was there and what impact it could have on a baby?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And if this genetic analysis was done 10 years ago, we'd find nothing, because we didn't even know the CALM genes existed, let alone cause sudden death in a young person. So this is a new gene. We've only known about it for about 6 or 7 years. And the actual precise mistake in the gene was only discovered in the last couple of years through more advanced genetic analysis. And, I should say that this is something that we deal with every week in our clinics at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, because we actually see families all the time where a young person has died suddenly, and trying to match any genetic abnormalities that might have led to that death is a real challenge. But really, I mean, this case really highlights the power of DNA, biology and the role of DNA mutations in human disease.
Well, looking ahead then, how important could DNA and genetics be in court cases and proving either guilt or innocence?
I think it's going to be more and more, we're going to see it more and more often, especially in young deaths. And, we used to, many years ago, look at sort of fingerprints as evidence, and now we've got sort of a genetic fingerprint where you and I have very similar genes, but we might have some subtle differences which makes you and me. And so I think this is an area where there's going to be a lot more investigation. I mean, DNA is a very powerful tool in these situations to try and identify a specific cause or reason why a young person has died suddenly.
So could this be a line in the sand for criminal investigation, if you like, that the discovery of fingerprints and the individuality of fingerprints was, years ago? Yeah,
I think, you can call it a DNA fingerprint. I mean, you can identify people now based on their genetic makeup, and so I think this is really important. I think there'll be, in both directions in the future, in the sense that some previously innocent people may actually be found to be not innocent, and vice versa. So I think it's going to play a big role as we look forward. And, we can now sequence all 22,000 genes that we carry in a few weeks. So the challenge is understanding what those genes actually do.
And you mentioned, Christopher, that families come to you in your clinic there with unexplained deaths in babies in their family, what's called SIDS, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. Is that now becoming more explained, that SIDS will become less common?
Yeah, it's a good term. It's a good question. It's not so much SIDS, it's actually called SADS, so sudden arrhythmic death in adults, which is becoming more and more explained. But SIDS also is death under 1 year of age. And there's certainly a proportion of what we used to call SIDS who are now more clearly a genetic problem underlying the death, the tragic death of a young baby.
The Australian man who was detained in Indonesia's most conservative Islamic province for an alcohol-fuelled rampage has been released from jail. Queenslander Bodie Risby-Jones has been locked up in Aceh province since late April and was facing up to 5 years behind bars. Police accused him of attacking multiple people, including a fisherman who suffered serious injuries. Risby-Jones apologised and was released after striking a $25,000 compensation deal with his victim's family.
I am very, very relieved and happy, and I'm very grateful too that I can go home. Overall, it is good.
Our Indonesia correspondent Bill Birtles has more.
It's been a 5-week saga for this 23-year-old Australian, but tonight he begins his journey home. Bodie Risby-Jones had been staying at a surf resort on a remote island in the province of Aceh, which practices Sharia law. Local villagers put him under a citizen's arrest. They claim that he was running around naked on a rampage. Now, Bodie later claimed he was wearing underwear, but he did concede he drank vodka, which is strictly prohibited in that part of Indonesia. He was facing up to 5 years in jail, maybe even a caning, but he averted that by paying $25,000 compensation to the family of the main victim, a local fisherman who sustained injuries. That compensation deal has taken a couple of weeks to be approved by national authorities. But now we understand, after being released, Bodie Risby-Jones will board an overnight ferry to the mainland of Aceh to a city named Mulabor. From there, he meets immigration authorities, does something procedural, and once that's finished, he's free to go. The thing is, getting direct flights out of that part of Indonesia is not easy, so it will probably still be a few days before he's able to get back home to Queensland and to see his family.
Days after India's worst rail disaster in 2 decades, trains slowly travel the same track, past derailed and mangled carriages. Operations resuming as repair works continue and further investigations get underway.
It's all right, but it's not completely fit yet.
275 people were killed in the crash on Friday after a passenger train hit a stationary freight train in the eastern state of Odisha, derailing on the tracks before colliding with another passenger train. 1,200 people were injured. Families have travelled to the region from across the country, searching for missing relatives.
We are very troubled, have not eaten properly in past 3 days. We have claimed one dead body.
Outside one hospital, photos of bodies are displayed on screens with a number, families watching for any clues that will identify loved ones.
I will die here if I don't get his body. I want to go to my village with his body.
Around 45 bodies have been identified so far, with 33 returned to relatives. In some cases, there's been confusion as different people try to claim the same person. A preliminary investigation points to a signalling failure as the likely cause of the crash, but not all agree.
The signalling system interlocking is fail-safe. There is no chance of malfunctioning in that.
India's Railway Board has recommended the Federal Central Bureau of Investigation take over the probe, and officials have now arrived at the site.
Members of the Central Bureau of Investigation and Commission of Railway Safety are working in different locations, and everyone is doing their own job. They are collecting evidence.
A separate inquiry led by a Commissioner of Railway Safety started on Monday. Sarah Jane Bell, ABC News.